Hi, everybody. Tonight, we begin a journey, not through fairy tales of knights and dragons, but through the cobbled streets, stone courtyards, and smoky interiors of a once mighty empire. The Ottoman Empire, with its domed mosques and shadowed bazaars, may stir thoughts of exotic grandeur, but beneath its silks and spires, life for many was far from the golden tales. Over the course of this story, told in 22 quiet chapters, we will unravel the veils of history to reveal the weariness, the waiting, and the weight of survival in a world ruled by power, privilege, and often pain. This story is not one of war or conquest, but of the ordinary people, peasants, craftsmen, women behind lattice windows, children in crumbling madrasas, janissaries whose dreams turn to dust. We'll take it slow, with each chapter uncovering a new fragment of life lived under the crescent moon. Not in anger, but with empathy. Not to judge the past, but to feel its breath, to see its shadows, and perhaps to find echoes of it in our own sleepless nights. So lay down, dear listener. Let the candle flicker low. And let us begin with part one. The wind carried the scent of copper and cumin through the winding alleys of Edirne. It was a city of contradictions. Once a capital, now a memory of faded splendor, with vine-choked fountains and crumbling caravanserais where traders no longer paused. Here, in the year 1624, a boy named Baron worked in silence behind his father's cobbler stall, his fingers red and raw from stretching leather in the chill. Baron was 12 years old, though his back hunched like an old man's. The empire was said to be vast and glorious. His father spoke of it often, especially after a few sips of sour wine, of golden palaces in Constantinople, of caftans sewn with thread from Persia, of sultans with eyes as sharp as scimitars. But Baron had never seen these marvels. He had seen hunger. He had seen the taxes come and never go. And he had seen the way his mother cried at night when the bread was too thin to feed 3 mouths. The cobbler's stall was little more than a plank of wood and a canvas sheet tied to 2 rusted nails. Flies swarmed the glue pot, and the tools, blunt awls, dented hammers, and worn-out lasts, spoke of better days long past. Baron's father, Hassan, had once crafted boots for a local aga, but now he patched slippers for shepherds and sandals for beggars. The aga had left for Istanbul, and with him, the gold. It wasn't that Baran disliked the work. It was honest. But every day was the same. Scrape, stitch, sigh. The city itself felt weary. Its stone roads no longer echoed with parades, but with coughing. Even the mosques, so noble in form, seemed tired of prayers unanswered. And yet the people trudged on, as though chained to a wheel that turned too slowly to notice. What made life heavy for families like Baran's wasn't war or famine, though those came too, but the quiet grinding of expectation. The Devshirme might come, his mother warned, whispering the word like a ghost's name. If Baran were taken, he would be marched away, trained to fight in foreign lands. She said it as a threat, but sometimes, when Baran's fingers bled from the cold, he thought perhaps it would be a mercy. To be swept away, to see something new, but he dared not say it. Above their alley, the sky dimmed to ash. Oil lamps flickered in latticed windows, their yellow glow casting long bars like prison shadows. Women moved quietly, carrying buckets of water, careful not to let their faces be seen. The empire demanded modesty, and it got it, sometimes through reverence, sometimes through fear. Baron's mother, Elif, had once laughed openly in the streets. Now she rarely left home, save for market days, wrapped in black and silence. Hassan returned that evening with tired eyes and fewer coins than yesterday. There had been a fight in the market, he said. A tax official accused a butcher of short-waiting meat. The janissaries arrived. Someone was struck with the flat of a sword. Baron asked no questions. This was not uncommon. Later, as they ate lentils from a cracked bowl, Elif turned her face to the wall. "What has happened to us?" she whispered. "What did we do to be born here in this time?" Hassan said nothing. Neither did Baran. Outside, the minaret called for prayer, a sound that had once stirred comfort. But tonight, it felt like a summons to endure. In the empire, religion was woven into the laws, the taxes, even the architecture. Every hour was watched, measured, and judged. Yet the weight of piety often bore down harder on the poor. Rich men could sin behind curtains. Poor men confessed just to survive. Baron knew the shape of the imam's staff better than the softness of a pillow. That night, Baron dreamed of a great sea. He stood on its shore, a red crescent moon reflected on the waves, and ships with black sails passed silently by. He did not wave. He did not speak. He only watched, wondering if they sailed toward better lives or simply carried more burdens across water. When morning came, he rose with the call to prayer, his legs stiff, his belly empty, and his heart unchanged. The Empire waited, as it always did, unmoving, unspeaking, unforgiving, and so begins our tale. Part 2. The frost lingered on the rooftops well past sunrise. The alley outside Baron's home shimmered with a thin sheet of ice, cracked only by the footfalls of the old bread seller dragging her wooden cart. She came every morning, just before the second call to prayer, her bones wrapped in wool, her breath a mist of hardship. Baron watched her from the doorway, arms crossed against the cold. He thought of asking her where the flour came from now, with the caravans from the east, delayed by snow and bandits. But he stayed silent. In the Ottoman streets, questions were not welcomed. They were invitations to trouble. The day began with the echo of sermons from the mosque nearby, its voice strong, though few listened closely anymore. Baron's father was already gone, having left early to plead for work repairing the strap of a soldier's saddle. Those jobs were rare and underpaid, but still better than patching the same pair of slippers thrice over. Elif sat in the corner of their room, spinning thread from raw wool, her fingers quick despite the chill that gnawed at her joints. This morning felt heavier than most. Word had spread that a new decree had been issued. Another tax, some said, though no one yet knew what it would be called. The Empire had many words for its burdens. Avaruz, Chizye, Oshur. Each one sounded different, but felt the same, like a hand squeezing tighter around a throat that could no longer cry out. Baran slipped into the street, his satchel slung across his back, heading not to school but toward the tannery by the river. He was not enrolled in the madrasa anymore. There had been no money for paper or ink, and the imam had grown tired of boys who could not recite without stumbling. At the tannery, there was always work, though the smell clung to one's skin like sin. It reeked of rot and lime, a sourness that sat beneath the nostrils and refused to be washed away. The path to the tannery led him past the bathhouse, where marble lions once spat warm water into mosaic basins. Now the bathhouse was closed, its doors barred after a sickness took 5 men in a single week. Some blamed the water, others the stars. The truth did not matter. Fear had made its home there, and fear was a more permanent resident than any merchant or mason. At the tannery, men toiled with hollow eyes and bandaged hands. The supervisor, a broad-shouldered man with a limp, nodded to Baran and pointed to a stack of hides near the basin. Baran nodded back and went to work, scraping fat and hair from stiff skins, the blade in his hand dull but steady. Around him, the older workers muttered to themselves, not out of madness, but out of habit. Talking aloud was a way to remind themselves they still existed. By midday, his hands were stained with gore and lime. He paused only once to drink from a cracked jug passed between laborers. It tasted of rust and river water. No one complained. Complaints were luxuries, and luxuries belonged to another world, the world beyond the walls of the Sultan's city, where rosewater ran in fountains and sweetmeats were served on plates of silver. When his work ended, Baran was paid in copper coins, fewer than promised. The supervisor shrugged when asked, muttering something about the governor's new levy. Baran did not argue. Instead, he tucked the coins into his sleeve and made his way home through a sky bruised purple with dusk. On his way back, he passed a line of women waiting at the well. They wore layers of veils and kept their eyes low. One of them, younger than the rest, dropped her pail and gasped as the wood cracked against the stone. No one helped her. Baran wanted to, but knew better. A boy alone did not intervene in the affairs of women, especially not in public. He kept walking, heart aching, steps quick. When he arrived home, his father was sitting by the hearth with a sour look. The repair job had been refused. The aga wanted a newer strap, not a mended one. Elif placed a bowl of thin soup before them, just enough for 2. She insisted she'd already eaten, though her hands trembled as she set the bowl down. That night, the family did not speak. Words had little power in a world where none listened. Outside, the city groaned under the weight of cold and silence. The mosque's call rose once more, but it felt like a song sung to the wind, beautiful but unheard. Baran lay down on the mat beside his father and stared at the cracked ceiling above. He imagined stars beyond it, hidden by smoke and stone. He wondered if they saw him, if they saw the city, if they knew how slowly life moved here, like molasses dripping down a wall. Sweet perhaps, but stagnant. He dreamed again, this time of a street lined with doors, each one opening to a different world. One held laughter, one held light, one held music he could not name. But every time he stepped toward one, it closed, soft but firm, like the hand of fate itself. Morning came once more, a new day, but not a new beginning. The empire endured, so did Baron. And that, in the Ottoman world, was the greatest triumph one could hope for. Part 3. The days grew shorter, and the shadows stretched longer over Edirne's weary streets. Winter in the Ottoman Empire was not a season of quiet snowfall and flickering hearths. It was a slow strangulation, a frost that crept beneath doors and settled into bones. Fires were scarce. Wood was dear. And for families like Baran's, warmth came not from flame, but from layers of patched cloth and silent endurance. Baran woke before the first call to prayer, his breath a pale cloud in the dim room. His father still slept, curled like a wounded animal, one hand tucked beneath his threadbare blanket. His mother sat awake beside a bundle of mending, the needle in her hand moving rhythmically, as if her fingers refused to rest even when her soul longed to. Outside, the sky was bruised with pre-dawn gray. Baran pulled on his rough-spun coat and slipped into the alley, careful not to wake the neighbors. His path this morning was not to the tannery, but to the city's edge, where a grocer had promised him a morning's wage for help unloading a shipment of lentils. The promise had been vague, but in Edirne, even a whisper of copper was worth chasing. The walk took him past the old cemetery, where stones leaned like drunks, their Arabic scripts worn smooth by wind and time. Baran paused there, not from fear, but from a strange sense of peace. The dead no longer worried about taxes or tannery burns. Their silence seemed kinder than the voices of the living. He arrived at the grocer's stall just as the cart rolled in, drawn by a skeletal mule and driven by a man with eyes like spent coals. The bags were heavy, split in places, and Baran's arms ached with the first lift. Still, he worked without complaint. The grocer did not speak much, save to curse the weight or the cold or the smell of the mule. When the last sack was placed inside, Baran stood quietly, waiting. The grocer counted out 3 coins, less than expected, and pressed them into his palm without apology. "Be grateful," he muttered. "There's boys with no work at all." Baran bowed his head and said nothing. He passed through the market on his way home, though he had no coin to spend. The stalls were quieter now, many shuttered with illness or fear. One seller hawked garlic cloves as medicine, another swore by onions against the plague. A man sat under a sign that read, "Dream Reader," his eyes rimmed in kohl, his hands stained with ink. Baran watched him for a moment, wondering what dreams the man saw, and if they were better than his own. At a stall selling cloth, he paused again. A bolt of deep blue silk hung behind the merchant's shoulder, catching what little light the sky offered. It shimmered like water. Baran imagined his mother in a dress made of such fabric. She would never wear it, of course. Blue was too bold, too proud, and silk belonged to women in Istanbul harems, not to mothers who mended shoes by candlelight. The empire had layers, like the onion sellers claimed. But not all layers were visible. There were those who ruled, those who served, and those who simply endured. Baran knew where he stood. Still, he dreamed. When he returned home, the room was filled with smoke. Elif knelt beside the brazier, coughing as she tried to coax warmth from a handful of damp twigs. Hazan sat by the door, rubbing his knees. His joints had begun to swell, a pain he bore without complaint, but not without consequence. "I got a little," Baran said, placing the coins on the floor. Hassan didn't speak, but Elif gave him a look, something between pride and sorrow. She tucked the coins away and stirred the pot of soup, thinner than before, made from dried vegetables and crushed barley. That night, the wind howled like a wounded dog. The city closed itself tighter, doors latched, windows shuttered. In the dark, Edirne felt like a tomb of the living. Somewhere far off, a muezzin sang the final call to prayer. The voice was beautiful, haunting even, but it sounded less like worship and more like mourning. Baran lay awake, his hands sore, his eyes gritty with sleep that would not come. He thought of the silk again, of the blue that shimmered like dreams. He imagined his mother twirling in it, her face lit with joy. He imagined a fire that never went out, a loaf of bread that never shrank, a life that did not ache. Then he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. They passed the alley, paused near their door, then moved on. Baran held his breath. Elif stirred but did not wake. Hassan grunted in his sleep. Outside, the footsteps faded. Perhaps it was a night guard. Perhaps not. The streets were not safe, even under the crescent moon. Eventually, sleep came, not like a wave, but like a fog, heavy and dull. In his dream, Baran stood in a palace corridor, endless and echoing. He wore a robe of blue silk and his hands were clean. But no matter how far he walked, no doors opened, and from every shadow a whisper, "Not yet, not for you." Morning would come again as it always did, and with it another day of cold, silence, and survival. In the Ottoman Empire, hope was not forbidden, but it was rare, and rarity, like silk, belonged to the few. Part 4. The days dragged onward, and Edirne lay beneath a sullen sky that refused to weep, though its clouds hung thick with unspilled sorrow. In the cold heart of winter, even the minarets looked brittle, tall spines of stone stretching skyward, their voices hoarse from calling to a people too tired to answer. The alleyways of the city grew narrower in the frost, as though the cold itself pressed in from all sides, tightening its grip on the bones of the poor. Inside their single-room dwelling, the cold was a fifth presence, unseen but ever watchful. Baran awoke before the first call to prayer, the air sharp in his nose, each breath a ghost drifting from his lips. His mother, Elif, sat huddled near the brazier, though there was no fire in it, only a few coals turned to ash. She rubbed her hands together, not for warmth, but out of habit. Her eyes were distant, her face drawn. His father, Hassan, had not risen. The mat beneath him was damp from sweat, his skin pale and his lips cracked. A tremble ran through him every so often, and Baran, though still a child, knew it was more than a chill. Something deeper had taken root in his father, something slow and quiet, like rot in a tree trunk. Baran said nothing, only rose and pulled on his worn coat, the hem patched and repatched until the original fabric could no longer be seen. Elif gave him a look and reached beneath a loose floor tile, drawing out a small twist of cloth. Inside were a few copper coins, just enough, she hoped, for garlic and maybe a bit of soap. "I'll go to the grocer," Baran said softly, taking the coins and a list scribbled on a scrap of cloth. "I'll be back before the sun's up." Elif nodded, her eyes returning to Hassan, who murmured something unintelligible in his sleep. Baran stepped into the freezing alley, his boots crunching on the thin crust of snow that had fallen in the night. The city still slept, though here and there he saw smoke rising from chimneys, thin streams that faded quickly into the gray sky. The market, when he reached it, was a quieter place than before. Many stalls were shuttered, their owners too ill or too wary to open. The ones that remained open displayed their goods with a sense of desperation. Garlic was being sold now not just for flavor, but as a ward against illness. Every house feared the creeping sickness that had begun to claim the weak and the old. Baran approached a grocer who leaned heavily on his counter. Wrapped in so many layers, he resembled a scarecrow stuffed with wool. The man's eyes were wary, rimmed with red. He did not greet Baran, only held out a hand. "Garlic?" Baran said, and placed the coins in the man's palm. "And soap, if you have it." The grocer grunted and reached beneath his stall, producing a small braid of garlic and a sliver of brown soap, hard as a stone. "No plum today. The caravan was delayed. Roads are bad. Snow's thick. Be glad for what you've got." Baran took the items and turned to leave, but paused when a soft voice called out to him. "You there, boy?" He turned to see a man standing beneath a stone archway, draped in a scholar's robe that had once been fine, but now bore the wear of years. His beard was trimmed, his eyes alert. He stepped forward with a linen-wrapped bundle in his hand. "Are you Elif's son?" he asked. Baran hesitated, then nodded. The man smiled faintly. "Tell her Zahid from the Zawaya still remembers her kindness. Tell her the olive tree behind the gate still grows." And then, before Baran could ask anything more, the man turned and disappeared into a side alley, leaving behind only the scent of clove and old parchment. Baran walked home with the garlic in one hand and the message in his mind. His thoughts churned as the city moved slowly around him. Beggars warming their hands over barrel fires, women carrying water, old men muttering prayers to the rhythm of their canes. When he reached home, Elif was kneeling by the brazier, still trying to coax heat from the dying coals. Hassan lay motionless, his breathing shallow. Baran placed the items before her, then repeated Zahid's words. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she rose, pulling on her thickest shawl. "Stay here," she said softly. "Watch your father. I'll be back before dusk." "Where are you going?" Baran asked. "To find an old friend," she replied, and left. The hours passed slowly. Hassan murmured in his sleep, sometimes crying out, sometimes whispering names Baran did not recognize. Baran wiped his father's brow with a cloth dampened from the melting snow outside. The garlic hung nearby, a poor shield against the cold or worse. Evening began to fall when Elif returned. Her cheeks were red from the wind, her eyes bright not with tears, but something else, something lighter. In her arms, she carried a linen bundle, which she placed carefully by the brazier. She unwrapped it slowly, reverently. Inside were dried dates, a twist of saffron wrapped in paper, a handful of sage leaves, and a note penned in elegant Ottoman script. "Sufi Zahid?" she said quietly. "He was a healer long ago, before things changed." She would not say more, but Baran didn't press. There were many stories in the empire that could not be told aloud, not for fear of forgetting, but for fear of being remembered. Elif brewed a tisane from the herbs and lifted Hassan's head to sip. Her hands were steady, her voice low as she whispered prayers with each spoonful. That night, the wind rose in the alleyways, but inside, the warmth from the herbal steam made the air feel less cruel. Baran lay beside the brazier, watching the flicker of the coals, listening to his father's breathing, no longer ragged, only shallow. He dreamed of an olive tree growing behind a gate, its leaves whispering secrets to the wind, and beside it, a figure, neither old nor young, standing watch. When morning came, his father stirred, and Elif wept, not from grief, but from relief. In the empire, that was a rare thing. And for now, it was enough. Part 5. The wind did not relent, but the fever did. Slowly, quietly, as if it had grown bored of tormenting Hassan and crept away into another household. He remained weak, unable to rise without Elif's help, but his eyes regained their focus, and the pallor in his skin faded into something closer to life. Elif prepared tisanes each morning, using the herbs Zahid had given her with a reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. The dates were eaten sparingly, half a one each night for Hassan, as if rationing sweetness to prolong a miracle. Baran watched it all with a quiet kind of awe. Not at the herbs, nor even at the strange man with a scholar's robes who had appeared like a ghost from a tale, but at his mother. How she moved with steady hands and silent purpose. How her grief had become routine, and her hope something private, not showy or loud, but buried deep and warm like embers under ash. The city outside did not change with Hassan's recovery. Sickness still crept along the alleys, its signs visible in shuttered stalls and hushed whispers. Children no longer played in the square, and the old man who used to feed the pigeons had not been seen for days. The muezzin's call still echoed 5 times a day, but it felt more like ritual than guidance, a habit rather than a comfort. On the 4th day since Zahid's visit, Elif sent Baran to the well. Their water jar had cracked in the cold, and they needed a new one. She handed him a small purse with the last of their saved coin, a painful gift, but necessary. The well was at the end of a street where the sun rarely touched. It was lined with frost and silence, a place where women gathered in veils and men kept their distance. Baran stood in line, the purse clutched tight, his breath forming short-lived clouds as he waited. Behind him, 2 women whispered, their voices too low for clarity, but loud enough to carry worry. "The taxman is coming again. They say the governor's men will take flour instead of coin this time." "And what of the Dev Sherm? My neighbor's son was taken last week. 12 years old. Just vanished." Baran's stomach tightened. The Dev Sherm, the gathering of Christian boys for the Sultan's service, was supposed to have slowed in recent years, but fear never quite left the city's poorer quarters. Though Baran was Muslim, the fear still lingered like a scent in the fabric. Disappearances happened. Some children went to study under imams and never returned. Others went to war before they had grown whiskers. And some were simply lost to time, spoken of only in murmurs, never openly. When his turn came, the well master eyed him with suspicion. "Too young to carry a full jar," he muttered, "and too thin to fetch more than one." Baran did not argue. He took the smallest jar the man would allow, paid with trembling hands, and left with the weight of clay and worry on his shoulders. He did not go straight home. Something in him turned his steps toward the Zawiya, the place where Zahid had once served and where the olive tree, according to his mother, still grew. The building stood at the edge of Edirne's older quarter, half forgotten by the city's pulse. Its walls were sun-bleached and cracked, the gates swollen from years of rain and disuse. Baran pushed it open slowly. Inside, the garden was quiet. Stone paths lay half buried under weeds. The air smelled of myrtle and damp earth, and there, near the back wall, grew the olive tree. Twisted and gnarled, its branches still bore green leaves, defiant against winter. Zahid sat beneath it, a book open in his lap. He did not look up right away. "You came," he said eventually. Baran stepped forward, unsure what to say. "I wanted to see the tree." Zahid smiled gently. So did many once, before the Sultan's eyes turned toward gold instead of souls. Baran didn't understand the words, not fully, but he understood their weight. "Your father will need more," Zahid said, closing the book. "The fever will return if the herbs are not refreshed. I will give them, but I ask something in return." Baran braced himself. "What?" "Stories," Zahid said, standing. "Yours, your father's, your mother's. Tell me what you see, what you hear in the streets. This empire is forgetting its people, but someone must remember." Baran nodded, uncertain but willing. Zahid handed him a new bundle, heavier than before. "Come back next week. Tell me everything." Baran left the Zawiya with the herbs tucked close and the clay jar in his other arm. The city felt different as he walked back, no warmer, no brighter, but somehow less vast, as if one corner of it now recognized him. At home, Elif unwrapped the bundle with care. She did not ask where it had come from. That night, as Hassan drank the new tizain and drifted into calmer sleep, Baran whispered the first of many stories to himself. About the women at the well, the grocer's suspicious eyes, the red mark on a neighbor's door. He would remember, for Zahid, for himself, and perhaps for the empire that no longer listened. Part 6. The snow came at last, heavy and silent, blanketing Edirne in a hush so deep it seemed the city had stopped breathing. It was not the gentle snow of paintings or poems. It came in thick, wet clumps that weighed down rooftops, clogged chimneys, and turned alleys into slick veins of slush and mud. For the wealthy quarters, it was a season of fur-lined cloaks and warm stews. But for Baran's family, it meant damp walls, cold soup, and aching limbs. Hassan grew stronger each day, though he could still not work. His cough lingered, dry and persistent. The herbs Zahid had given helped, but the supply dwindled with each steeping, and Baran knew the time would soon come for another visit to the Zawiya. Yet the snow made the city slower, more treacherous. Merchants delayed opening their stalls. The tannery closed entirely for a week, its vats frozen solid, its workers left to idle, unpaid. Elif did what she could, spinning thread, mending cloth, offering to help neighbors with small tasks for food scraps or firewood. She spoke little of Zahid, but her fingers often paused on the edge of her shawl when his name was mentioned, as if brushing against a thought not yet ready to be spoken aloud. Baran kept close to the window, watching the street. Snow softened the city's rough edges. The grime of the walls, the scars of old quarrels etched in doorframes, the rotted beams, all hidden beneath a coat of white. It made the world seem purer, kinder, but only if you did not look too closely. On the third day of snow, a knock came at the door. 3 slow raps. Elif froze. Baran moved first, peering through a crack in the wood. It was a man in an official's cloak, flanked by 2 soldiers. "Elif of House Hassan," the man called. "By order of the provincial court, you are summoned." Baran opened the door before Elif could stop him. The man's face was unreadable, lips chapped from cold, eyes sharp beneath a woolen cap. He held a scroll in one gloved hand and a cane in the other. Not for walking, but for striking, Baran sensed. "What is this about?" Elif asked, her voice low and even. "A matter of property and obligation," the man replied. "Your late uncle's estate is under review. The court requires your testimony." Baran felt her body stiffen beside him. "My uncle died 15 years ago," she said. "He had no property." The man smiled without warmth. "That is what we intend to verify." They gave her until noon the next day to appear at the magistrate's chamber. After they left, Elif sat by the brazier for a long time, unmoving. Hassan stirred but said nothing. He had heard. He remembered. Baran did not understand the full shape of this new worry, but he knew it was heavy, rooted in something deeper than debt or illness. That night, Elif packed her few fine things, a scarf with silver threads, a carved wooden comb, a folded letter wrapped in waxed cloth. She handed Baran a slip of paper with Zahid's name and a line of writing. "If anything happens," she said, "go to him." "Why would something happen?" Baran asked, but she did not answer. She left before dawn, her shape swallowed by the snow. Baran watched her go from the window, heart thudding, unsure if it was fear or anger or simply the ache of helplessness. The day passed without news. Hassan dozed beside the fire, and Baran tried to keep the soup from burning, though the pot was nearly empty. When evening came, she had not returned. Baran waited until the call to prayer echoed through the city. Still no footsteps. He could wait no longer. He wrapped himself in his coat, tucked the paper inside his shirt, and slipped out into the snow, the city now a maze of shadows and muffled sounds. The Zawiya was farther than he remembered, the snow deeper, the silence more complete. But the olive tree still stood, its branches heavy with white, and beneath it, Zahid waited, as if expecting him. Baran did not speak at first. He only held out the paper. Zahid read it, then nodded slowly. "Come inside," he said. "Tell me what you've seen." They sat in the warmth of the small prayer hall, a single oil lamp casting their shadows long across the floor. Baran spoke of the officials, of Elif's summons, of the silence that followed. Zahid listened, his eyes narrowing, his hands folded. "She spoke once of an inheritance," he said quietly. "But she did not want it, said it would bring trouble." Baran looked up. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that doesn't forget," Zahid replied. "Your uncle was once tied to a rebellion, long ago, forgotten by most, but not by the Empire." Baran's stomach turned. "So why summon her now?" "Because the Empire is hungry," Zahid said. "And hunger makes even the past worth devouring." They sat in silence as the lamp flickered. Outside, the snow fell thicker. "We will wait," Zahid said finally. "And if she does not return, we will go to the magistrate ourselves." Baran nodded. He did not know what help he could offer, but he knew now the city's dangers were not only cold and illness, but memory. The Empire never truly forgot, and now it remembered Elif. Part 7 morning arrived not with light, but with a kind of colorless hush, a dimness that filled the city like smoke. The snowfall from the previous night had grown heavier, and by dawn Edirne lay beneath a thick white shroud that seemed to press down on the roofs and windows, muting every sound and motion. At the Zawiya, the quiet felt sacred. Within its crumbling walls, a fire crackled softly in a corner, and the scent of sage and old wax filled the air. Baran awoke beneath a rough woolen quilt laid gently across his shoulders. His body was warm, but his heart churned. His mother had not returned. The hours had crawled by after her departure to the magistrate's hall, and now, a full night later, the silence spoke louder than any answer. Elif, who always returned before the call to evening prayer, who had never once vanished without word or sign, she was gone. Zahid stood near the small brazier, tending to the flames with a deliberate calm that barely masked the tension in his posture. He looked like a man deep in thought, as though weighing every memory of Elif, every whispered name and unspoken truth against the reality now closing around them. "She should have returned before sunset," Baran said, rising. "It's not like her." Zahid nodded slowly. "No, it isn't. What if she's been taken?" Baran's voice cracked despite himself. "What if the magistrate? What if they never meant to let her go?" Zahid's gaze sharpened, but his voice remained calm. "It's possible. But we must not act on fear. Fear is a net, and once it catches you, it is hard to escape." He walked over to a shelf where a small, ink-stained notebook lay. Opening it, he thumbed through several pages before tearing out a sheet and beginning to write. His script was elegant, curling and precise, the ink fresh and black against the yellowing page. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and sealed it with a tiny mark pressed into a smear of wax. "Deliver this," he said, handing the folded paper to Baran. "To a man named Halim. He runs a leather stall near the tannery. Ask for goatskin belts. If he asks who sent you, say the tree still grows." Baran took the letter and tucked it into the lining of his coat. "What is this? What will it do?" Zahid gave a faint smile. "Halim is not what he seems. He owes me a favor, and now he will help us find your mother." They left the Zawiya together, Baran heading toward the tannery, while Zahid moved in another direction, saying he would visit a scholar who once worked within the magistrate's circle. The city was changed in the light of snow, not gentler, but more deceptive. What looked smooth under the white surface was often jagged. What seemed quiet held whispers just beneath the frost. The tannery was a muted ruin of its former noise. The vats were half frozen, the work halted. A few men loitered near the stalls, warming their hands over braziers. Halim's stall was tucked beneath a low awning weighed down by snow. Leather straps hung from wooden rods, and a few cracked belts lay neatly displayed. Baron approached with measured steps. "I'm looking for goatskin belts," he said. Halim, a wiry man with gray streaks in his beard, looked up slowly. His eyes scanned Baron's face before dropping to the letter now held in his hand. "Who sent you?" Baron replied without hesitation. "The tree still grows." Halim nodded once and reached out, taking the paper. He did not open it there, only slipped it into his coat. "Come back after the third call to prayer," he said. "There will be news." Baron left without another word, his boots crunching over the thin crust of ice that had begun to form where snow had been packed by many feet. The cold bit deeper now, as if the world had heard their concerns and tightened its grip. Back at the Zawiya, Zahid had returned, and his expression was dark. "The scholar told me nothing directly," he said, "but he said the magistrate has been hosting closed inquiries in the old chambers under the hall. Those rooms were meant for storing documents, not people." Baron's heart dropped. "You think she's there?" "I don't know," Zahid said, "but if she spoke too freely, if she mentioned her uncle or his beliefs, or where she learned them." "She didn't believe in rebellion," Baron said. "No," Zahid agreed. "But sometimes what matters isn't belief. It's association, guilt by memory." They waited in silence through the long stretch of afternoon, drinking weak tea and tending to the small fire. The Zawiya's stillness had once felt holy to Baran. Now it felt like a prison of helplessness. As the third call to prayer rang out, they returned to Halim's stall. The man stood as before, this time with a wrapped bundle in his hand. "She's not in the court records," Halim said quietly. "No official detainment, no public accusation." "Then where is she?" Baran asked. "There's a warehouse," Halim replied. "Near the river, used by the magistrate's scribes when they need privacy. I can't say what happens there, but you're Zahid here. He's known by those who listen. That might open a door." Zahid gave a grim nod. "Then we go tonight." Baran turned his eyes toward the river, though it lay hidden behind walls and snow. Somewhere beyond that bend of stone and ice, his mother might be waiting, or locked, or worse. But the fear that once rooted him was beginning to burn. The Empire remembered too well. Now he would remember also, and he would not wait in silence. Part 8. The river ran slow and dark beneath the snow, its current muffled by sheets of ice and the silence of midnight. Along its banks, the city exhaled steam from hidden vents and half-frozen chimneys, casting ghost-like plumes into the still air. The moon hung low and veiled behind clouds, lending only the faintest light to the narrow lanes that sloped toward the water's edge. It was here, in this forgotten quarter of Edirne, that Baran and Zahid now walked, silent, cloaked, alert. They moved through streets known only to those who kept their lives close to their chest. Tanners, boatmen, smugglers, and those in the Empire who operated not by rule, but by quiet understanding. Zahid led the way with confidence born not of arrogance, but of experience. He knew where eyes might be watching from shuttered windows, and where the guards rotated their patrols, and how long they lingered at the tea shop on the corner of the spice warehouse. Ahead of them, nestled between a crumbling soap workshop and an abandoned candlemaker's stall, stood the building Helm had spoken of. A 2-story stone structure, its arched windows boarded, its doors fortified with thick wood and iron. No signage marked its purpose. No guards stood outside, yet a single oil lamp glowed behind one slat of the shuttered window. "This was once a storehouse for Waqf records," Zahid whispered. "Charitable endowments, land titles, family registries. But over time, it became more than that, a place where memories are erased." Baron's breath steamed in the air. "And you think she's inside?" "If she is, she won't be on any register. They'll say she never came, or that she left freely. Either way, we must be sure." He pulled from beneath his cloak a small pouch. Inside were 2 small coins, not of silver or copper, but lead, stamped with a faded seal. Baron had never seen such tokens before. "They are used by the old scribes," Zahid said. Badges of office, or rather, shadows of office. I kept these from long ago. One might still open a door. Baran watched as Zahid approached the building's side, where a smaller, warped door stood recessed into the stone. Zahid tapped 3 times, then paused, then tapped once more. A moment later, the door creaked open just a sliver. A face appeared, gaunt, pale, rimmed in the flickering light of a wall lamp. "Zahid ibn Kamal?" the figure whispered. "I need a favor," Zahid replied, slipping one of the lead tokens into the man's hand. A pause, then the door opened wider. Baran followed Zahid into the dim corridor, the smell of mold and damp parchment thick in the air. The door closed behind them with a weighty thud. The corridor curved downward, its walls lined with empty shelves. Here and there, crates sat half-rotted, their labels faded into unreadable smears. They moved quickly, the gatekeeper leading them with hurried steps until they reached a low archway. The guard raised a lantern and peered into Zahid's face once more. "She's below," he murmured. "Farcel, no record kept. You have 1 hour." Zahid nodded, and they descended a tight stone stair, spiraling into the dark. The air grew colder, sharper, more still. Baran's stomach twisted. The silence here was unnatural, thick, heavy, like water pressing against glass. The corridor below was barely lit, only a single oil lamp burning at the far end. Iron doors lined one side, their hinges rusted, their locks new. Zahid moved carefully, eyes scanning each as they passed. Then a voice, faint, cracked. "Elif?" Baran rushed forward, and through the slit in the final door, he saw her. Pale, seated on a low bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but her eyes, sharp, alert, alive. "Baran," she breathed, her voice trembling. "Elif," Zahid called gently. "We're here. We'll get you out." "There's no time," she said. They asked about names, about the Zawiya, about the books I once read. They think I'm hiding something. They think I'm a message from the past." Zahid moved to the lock and examined it. "It's sealed from the scribe's office upstairs," he said, "but I may know how to open it." Baran slid his hand through the bars and held hers. "You're not a message," he said. "You're our family, that's all." But Elif shook her head. "They don't want the truth, Baran. They want to silence anything that remembers." Zahid returned moments later with a ring of old keys, each shaped differently, none labeled. He tried one after another, the iron groaning with each attempt. Then, at last, a click. The door creaked open. Baran rushed in, embracing his mother, holding her as if she might vanish again. "We must go," Zahid urged. "Now." They retraced their steps through the corridor, up the winding stair, back to the arched entry. The gatekeeper let them pass without a word, and soon they stood once more beneath the veiled sky, the air now colder, the snow lighter. As they made their way through the alleys, Elif leaned against Zahid, her strength fading. But her eyes remained fixed ahead. "Why now?" she asked at last. "Why do they remember me now?" "Because the Empire is hungry," Zahid murmured, "and when it has eaten all its enemies, it begins to feed on memory." Back at the Zawiya, Baran prepared a mat for her to rest, placing a fresh cloth over her shoulders. Hassan would not know yet. He still lay resting at home, but soon he would. That night, Elif slept soundly for the first time in days. Baran sat beside her, watching the slow rise and fall of her breath. The Empire could silence many things, but not the will to return, not the strength to endure, and not the memory of those who refused to be forgotten. Part 9. The snow had become a permanent fixture in Edirne, transforming from a passing season into something more enduring, more elemental. Days bled into one another beneath the same gray sky, and the cold was no longer a visitor. It was part of the city's breath, its very rhythm. Ice webbed across the corners of windows, and smoke from low fires drifted like prayers through the alleys. For those without coin, winter meant bargaining not with time, but with comfort, health, and sometimes memory. Elif, though returned from the cold stone of the hidden cell, did not recover swiftly. Her strength came in fits, a few hours upright, then many more wrapped in layers beside the brazier. Zahid brought herbs daily, brewed teas with a steady hand, and ensured no watchers followed him back to the home Baran shared with his parents. The Zawiya, for now, was quiet, but in Zahid's eyes lingered a concern that the silence would not last. Baran moved through the days in a new skin, one woven from worry, urgency, and something heavier. He no longer looked at the city as he once had. Now, every passerby might carry suspicion. Every closed shutter might conceal a listening ear. His world had narrowed to the space between his mother's labored breaths and the distant murmur of authority. On the second evening after Elif's return, when a milky fog hung low over the rooftops and the world felt suspended in stillness, she called him to her side. The brazier flickered gently beside them, its orange glow casting long shadows across the stone walls. She sat propped on a pillow, a woolen shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders, and in her lap was a bundle. "I need you to know what they were looking for," she said softly. "Why they brought me there. Why they may come again." Baron sat cross-legged before her, watching her hands as she untied the bundle. Inside was an old leather shoe, worn, cracked, barely recognizable as something once worn on a foot. She pulled it apart carefully, and from the hollow of its heel, she drew out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. "This is one," she whispered. "One of my uncle's letters." Baron reached forward, gently taking it in his hands. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the script was still legible, elegant, curving, with the patience of a scholar's hand. He began to read aloud. "To remember is not to rebel. It is to hold truth like a candle in the dark. They will say we wished to undo the empire, but all we wanted was to be seen, to be heard, not as threats, but as witnesses." Baron looked up. "He wrote this before?" "Before they took him. Before the accusations. He had once been a teacher in Bursa, a scholar of history. He believed that the empire, for all its strength, must never stop listening to its people. That silence is not peace. It is fear." "And they hanged him," Baran said, his voice flat. "They made an example," Elif replied. "But they never found these." She drew out more scraps. Letters, fragments of reflections, even verses of poetry written in the margins of legal records. Words that carried no overt rebellion, but held something deeper. Memory, identity, dangerous things. Zahid arrived as the letters were being read. He listened without interrupting, then finally spoke. "You kept them all this time?" Elif nodded. "I couldn't burn them. I couldn't forget." Zahid sat beside Baran, reaching for one of the pages. He read in silence, then said, "These are not the writings of a rebel. These are the words of someone who loved his country too much to lie about it." "But the empire doesn't want truth," Baran said bitterly. "It wants obedience." "Yes," Zahid replied, "and when obedience is not given freely, it demands silence. That's why your mother's memory frightens them." Baran glanced down at the letters, then back at Elif. "What should we do with them?" "Hide them again," she said, "but not in darkness. Keep them where one day they can be read." Zahid added, "There are others who collect such writings, quietly. They build libraries in forgotten places. I can send word." Baran felt something stir within him, not defiance, not quite hope, but the weight of inheritance. Not of land or coin, but of story. He realized then that survival in this empire was not just about enduring hunger or illness. It was about guarding what could not be seen, thought, memory, names. Elif leaned back, her voice faint. "They thought they could erase my uncle by removing him. But here he is, in ink, in breath, in you." Later that night, while Elif slept and Hassan dozed beside her, Baran sat by the window. He could not see the stars, only the soft glow of oil lamps and the mist curling above the rooftops. In his hands, he held a single letter, reading it again and again, committing each word to memory. And when he finally closed his eyes, he did not dream of soldiers, or snow, or the cold stone of the magistrate's cell. He dreamed of shelves, endless shelves filled with books and pages, and voices long gone echoing in their words. He dreamed of remembering. And that, perhaps, was the bravest thing of all. The sun had scarcely warmed the pale stone walls of the Anatolian hillside when the village watchman called the dawn. His voice echoed across the sleeping valley, caught on the low mists that curled through olive groves and rocky pastures. In the distance, the clang of a lone bell marked the start of the day, calling the faithful to the mosque. But for Daria, a woman whose soul had grown weary of both silence and sound, it was simply another morning in a world she no longer understood. Daria had not always been so tired. There was a time, not long ago, when she had walked through the same market square with her basket high on her hip, laughing with neighbors as they haggled for figs and soft cheese. But the Sultan's new decrees had rolled in like a desert storm. Quiet at first, then thundering with finality. Her husband had been taken, conscripted into the Janissaries, though he was neither young nor willing. For the glory of the empire, they'd said. Glory tasted bitter when your children cried for their father each night, and the bread rations grew thinner than the morning mist. The Ottomans prided themselves on their vast dominion, from the golden domes of Constantinople to the rugged cliffs of the Balkans. But in that expanse, the common people often became no more than whispers. The weight of empire was heavy, not only in taxes, but in the soul. Each edict from the capital felt like a pebble dropped into Daria's life, rippling through everything she held dear. This morning, like many before, she tied her faded headscarf beneath her chin and stepped out into the dust. Her feet knew the path well, the narrow road past the lime-washed houses, the well with the creaking pulley, and the archway draped with grapevines where old men sat and spoke of better days. She greeted them with a nod, but not a smile. Smiles, once abundant in the village, had become a rare currency. What had broken them so slowly was not just hardship, it was the erosion of hope. When her father was a young man, the empire still had stories, glorious battles, loyal viziers, just sultans. But those tales grew stale, repeated too often by men who had never seen the palace gates, let alone the throne. Daria's world was ruled by tax collectors and the fear of denunciation. If one spoke too freely, too carelessly, there were ears everywhere. The walls, it seemed, had grown mouths. She paused by the baker's shop. Its doorway scented faintly with smoke and dough. Once, the shelves would brim with loaves, their crusts golden and split, hot from the oven. Now a few rolls sat beneath a cloth, their texture more brick than bread. She handed over 2 coins, the silver nearly worn flat, and the baker's wife gave her a roll without meeting her gaze. "Another increase," the woman muttered, eyes on her hands. "They want more for the war fund." Daria said nothing. Everyone knew the war was not theirs to fight, yet everyone paid for it, whether in coin, in sons, or in silence. The empire's appetite was insatiable. As she returned home, a pair of soldiers passed on horseback, their curved sabers catching the sun. They looked neither at her nor anyone else, their faces as cold as the steel they bore. They belonged to a different world, a world of power and distance, where peasants were obstacles, not people. Even the village elders bowed their heads when they rode by, as though fear itself had taken shape in Ottoman armor. Back in her courtyard, Daria poured water over her hands from a copper jug, watching it trail into the earth. Her children played quietly in the shade, too accustomed to hunger to ask for breakfast. She ruffled her son's hair and kissed her daughter's brow, but her heart was heavy. She had heard whispers that girls were being taken now too, under new interpretations of the Devshirme system. Not for the army, but for the palace, for the harem. She could not imagine her daughter cloaked in silks, serving beneath gilded ceilings. That was not a life. It was a prison of another kind. And so she worked. With calloused hands, she scrubbed, she stitched, she prayed. Not for prosperity, she no longer believed in that, but for the quiet continuation of her children's lives, that they might grow old without being caught in the gears of the empire's great machine. That afternoon, the muezzin called again, and the village paused. Prayers were still offered, though faith had begun to feel like a chain. Daria knelt beside her children, whispering ancient words as her mind wandered. She thought of the mountains far beyond the valley, where the empire's grasp was weaker, where some said a person could live unbothered by sultans or soldiers. But such places were myths, like the old stories her mother used to tell, of jinn in the desert and rivers that ran with milk. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the village, Daria lit a small oil lamp. Its glow flickered over the stone walls, warm and weak. She sat beside it, sewing a patch into her son's tunic, the needle flashing in and out like a tiny silver fish. Outside, the wind stirred the olive trees, their leaves whispering secrets to one another. The world was changing. The empire creaked beneath its own weight, even as it claimed eternal strength. Daria could feel it in her bones, in the absence of laughter, in the stillness of the nights. And yet, she endured. Not because she believed things would improve, but because she must. Because her children needed a tomorrow, even if it looked exactly like today. Somewhere far away, beyond the hills and the bureaucracy, the Sultan sat upon his throne, wrapped in brocade and surrounded by perfumed courtiers. He would never know Daria's name. He would never see her cracked hands or hear the prayers she whispered through her tears. And still, she carried him upon her back, like so many others in the shadow of the empire. The lamp sputtered, the stars rose, and another day beneath the crescent moon came to its quiet, sorrowful end. In the heart of the city of Bursa, once the capital of the Ottoman forefathers, the dusk fell slowly, draping the ancient minarets and sloping rooftops in veils of golden ash. The scent of smoke, spice, and damp stone lingered in the narrow alleys like old memories, and the quiet murmur of life wound its way through the bazaars now hushed for the evening. Among the tangle of courtyards and low domed inns lived Yusuf, a man whose youth had slipped from him without ever truly arriving. Yusuf had been born the son of a weaver, and the son of a weaver was expected to live by the loom. But his father's fingers had grown stiff with age, and Yusuf's had never taken to the threads. Instead, he swept floors at the local madrasa, fetching ink and sand for the students, lighting their oil lamps, and emptying their chamber pots. He listened more than he spoke, and what he heard there changed him. The scholars argued in circles, quoting Persian poets and Arabic theologians. They debated the will of Allah, the shape of the universe, the nature of obedience. Their voices rose like birds in a storm, brilliant and bright, while Yusuf moved unnoticed through their ranks, his heart stirring with strange yearnings, not for power nor wealth, but simply for understanding. Yet knowledge, like bread, had become expensive. Only the sons of the privileged studied beneath tiled domes. For the rest, there were only decrees to memorize and taxes to pay. Yusuf's longing for books became a quiet ache, one he buried beneath hours of silent service. He carried questions in his chest like coals, glowing softly beneath layers of ash. His room was no more than a cupboard beside the bathhouse wall, where the bricks wept with condensation and the straw mattress bore the weight of many previous tenants. But within it, he had hidden treasures: a broken slate, 2 pages of Ibn Sina's treatises rescued from a fire, and a dull quill he'd stolen from a merchant's cart. Each night, when the call to prayer had long faded and the world lay hushed beneath the stars, he would light his lamp and trace invisible letters in the air, reciting words he could barely pronounce. It was a lonely existence, yet not without beauty. Sometimes, on feast days, a dervish would pass through the city and perform in the square. Yusuf would watch the twirl of robes and the ecstasy in the man's face, feeling something stir inside him. Not faith, Yusuf had made uneasy peace with the idea that the divine, if it saw him at all, did so with indifference, but awe. The awe of movement, of devotion, of something just beyond his reach. But even awe could not warm a man's belly, and Yusuf grew thin. The stipends paid to servants like him barely covered lentils and salt. He avoided the gaze of street beggars, not from cruelty, but because he feared he would join them soon. The empire, as always, stretched its hand farther than it could fill. The students at the madrasa complained of supply shortages. No new ink, no paper, only chalk and old parchment scraped thin. Yet they were still the lucky ones. Taxes had risen again that month, under the justification of frontier fortifications. The eastern border had become a boiling cauldron of unrest, and the Sultan's administrators demanded more from the urban poor. In Bursa, this meant that every loaf, every candle, every measure of barley cost more than it had a week before. For Yusuf, it meant skipping his only meal most days. Still, he remained at the madrasa. It gave him shelter, and more than that, it gave him glimpses. He overheard lessons on astronomy, murmured prayers in Turkish and Arabic, and caught the scent of ink and old vellum, scents that reminded him somehow that the world was once full of promise. Then, one winter night, as snow dusted the eaves like flour on a baker's board, he saw something that would haunt him for years. A boy, no older than 10, was dragged from the mosque courtyard by 2 sipahis, their horses stamping and bridles clinking in the silence. No explanation was given, no trial. The boy's father ran after them, shouting that his son had done no wrong. But the soldiers did not pause. Whispers later said the boy had spoken ill of the Sultan's new land taxes. Others said he had simply repeated something he overheard at the tannery. Either way, he vanished into the bowels of the local garrison, and Yusuf never saw him again. That was the moment something in Yusuf shifted. The line between learning and obedience, between curiosity and sedition, was thinner than a thread of silk. The empire tolerated knowledge only when it bent the knee. Anything else was seen as a challenge, a crack in the perfect mirror they tried to polish each day. The next morning, Yusuf packed his few belongings into a cloth sack. He left the broken slate, but took the pages of Ibn Sina and the dull quill. There was nothing for him in Bursa but ghosts and cold soup. He didn't know where he would go, perhaps to the villages in the west, where a cousin had once found work as a porter. Perhaps to Edirne, or to the mountains, where rumor said rebels still roamed. As he walked through the silent city gate, Yusuf turned once to look back at the spires and rooftops bathed in morning frost. The domes of the madrasa caught the light, beautiful and distant, like a memory of a place that had never truly belonged to him. Then he lowered his gaze, pulled his cloak tighter, and walked on. He was one of many, forgotten men slipping through the cracks of a great and crumbling empire, their stories rarely told, their pain unmeasured. But in his chest still burned those coals of yearning, dim but not dead, and as the snow fell in gentle silence, Yusuf pressed forward into a world that offered no guarantees, but at last, a choice. In the arid stretch of land bordering the great Tigris, where the river's slow bends glimmered like dull silver under the sun, there stood a village whose name had long since faded from any official scroll. It was a place shaped more by the whims of wind and dust than by the hand of the Sultan. The walls were built from sun-dried mud brick, patched and repatched across generations, and the roofs sagged under the weight of old age and older griefs. Here lived Hassan, once a master of horses, now a man bound more to memory than to motion. In his youth, he had served in the caravanserais along the Silk Road, tending to merchant steeds and training foals that came from the east with silken manes and spirits wild as the deserts. But that was before the route dried up, before the empire tightened its grasp on trade and the tolls grew heavier than the wares they taxed. Now Hassan's stables stood mostly empty, echoing with the faint scent of straw and faded hopes. A single mare remained, grayed with age, blind in one eye, her pace slow and careful. She was not kept for labor, but for companionship, a reminder that once there had been movement, purpose, and dignity in his work. The empire's rot, Hassan believed, did not begin with war or famine. It began with forgetfulness. The forgetfulness of the highborn who decreed from marble halls without ever tasting the heat of the southern plains. The forgetfulness of taxmen who came demanding coin where none had been minted in seasons. The forgetfulness of the Sultan himself, who sent out riders with demands for grain and wool, but sent no seed, no water, no word of comfort. One winter, a flood had taken the southern fields, washing away the barley just days before harvest. The village appealed to the provincial bey for relief, but none came. Instead, 2 months later, a troop of soldiers arrived to collect the grain quota regardless. They confiscated what little food was stored for the winter, leaving the villagers to boil wild roots and pray for mercy that never came. Hassan, already an old man then, remembered standing before the captain, his hands calloused and open, saying, "There is nothing left to take." The captain, a boy no older than 20, looked at him with hollow eyes and said, "Then we take the horses," as if horses were coin, as if beasts could grow from salted ground. And so they had taken them, all of them, save the one blind mare that even the captain had considered useless. But Hassan had not seen her as useless. He had seen in her the same stubborn spark he felt in himself, weary but not extinguished. Now, each evening, he walked her along the edge of the river where reeds swayed and frogs croaked their ancient songs. He spoke to her softly, words not meant for answers but for remembering. He told her stories of the road, of camels and cold stars, of Persian traders with coal-lined eyes and heavy silk sashes. The mare listened in her own quiet way, tail flicking, hooves sinking slightly into the loamy bank. Children still played in the village, their games a strange blend of joy and solemnity. They had not known the old world, the days when merchants brought news from distant lands and coins bore the image of sultans who still inspired fear and wonder. These children knew only empty markets, broken promises, and the silent endurance of their parents. Still, they laughed, even as they grew thinner each season, their feet bare and their futures uncertain. Once, a traveling imam visited the village and spoke at length about loyalty and patience. He wore fine robes and rode a well-groomed horse, and when he passed by Hassan's gate, he offered a blessing without stopping. The villagers gathered to hear him, hoping perhaps for news, perhaps for food. Instead, they were told to fast more earnestly, to pray more fervently, and to remember that suffering cleansed the soul. After he had gone, Hassan sat beneath the fig tree by the well, his hands resting on his knees, and muttered, "It is easy to call suffering holy when your belly is full." No one argued. They were too tired, too accustomed to the bitter truth beneath sweet words. The empire, they said, was eternal. But eternal for whom? The farmers who buried their children in shallow graves? The women who sold heirlooms for a bag of flour? Or the bureaucrats whose ink never dried, whose records never told of the pain behind each scribbled name? Still, life continued, as it always had. Hassan found small joy in repairing old harnesses, braiding rope from salvaged fibers, and teaching the village boys how to approach a skittish colt. Even without horses, the motions comforted him. They reminded him of order, of skill, of human hands shaping something into worth. One evening, as the call to prayer drifted from the crooked minaret, Hassan sat with his back against the stable wall, the mare beside him, her breath warm and slow. The stars emerged, flickering one by one, like scattered embers from a forgotten fire. He looked up at them and thought of his father, who had told him that stars were the souls of good men who never bowed too low. He did not know if he believed that anymore. But he did know that somewhere, in some corner of the empire, someone else was likely staring at the same stars, bearing the same weight, wondering when the empire would remember them again. And so he closed his eyes, letting the night wrap around him like an old blanket, listening to the distant croak of frogs and the soft shift of the mare beside him, as if even in forgetting, there might still be peace. In the stifling summer of the Anatolian plateau, where the days stretched long and golden and the earth cracked beneath the heat, there was a fortress town named Karsak. Built of heavy basalt stone and positioned along a critical trade artery, Karsak had once stood proud as a beacon of defense and commerce. But now its towers cast shadows over empty courtyards, and its gates groaned open each morning not to welcome merchants, but to inspect the departing poor. Among its residents was Selim, a man whose shoulders bore the invisible weight of generations. He had once been a cobbler, known for stitching boots that lasted through mountain snow and desert dust alike. His shop had sat near the eastern gate, beneath a canopy of faded wool, where he shared tea and gossip with passersby while working his awl and leather. But Selim no longer worked leather. His hands had been broken, figuratively at first, by the collapse of trade, and later, literally, in a prison courtyard after he refused to surrender his tools to the town's corrupt steward. The story of that day was still whispered by lantern light among neighbors. A tax inspector, clad in silks too fine for Karsak, had come demanding that every craftsman donate tools for the Sultan's campaign in the east. Selim, who lived with the grief of a lost son and the exhaustion of a life spent mending souls, had said no. Not with anger, but with a quiet finality that unsettled the inspector. So the guards were called, and Selim was dragged from his shop. His neighbors did not intervene. Not from cowardice, but from the knowledge that resistance bore bitter fruit. He was beaten in the courtyard and returned home with hands so swollen and stiff he could no longer grip a needle. His tools, of course, were taken anyway. Now Selim sat each day beneath the same awning, not working, but watching. The shop remained open, more as a symbol than a business. His wife, Alif, had taken to weaving belts and headscarves, selling them to anyone who still had coin or trade to offer. Their daughter, Zainab, helped her, though her eyes often wandered to the horizon, dreaming of cities she had never seen. What most disturbed Selim was not his pain, but the transformation of Karsak itself. It had become a shell, a town that still bore the title of a fortress, yet lacked the strength to protect even its own dignity. The garrison drank away their rations. The administrator's scribes changed the rules weekly, and the people became shadows, moving through the streets without eye contact or conversation. The mosques still held prayer, but they echoed now with more desperation than devotion. In one corner of town, an old imam had taken to preaching strange things, that the empire had strayed too far from justice, that the caliphate had lost its soul. Some said he was mad. Others listened in silence, then disappeared the next day. Selim noticed these disappearances. One by one, faces he had known for years faded from the market and the baths. He did not ask questions. In Karsak, Questions were dangerous. Even children learned quickly to speak softly, to step lightly, to keep their thoughts behind their teeth. One afternoon, while sitting outside his shop, Selim watched a parade of officials march through the town square. They wore plum-colored robes trimmed with fur, a mockery in the heat, and they moved with the air of men who had long forgotten hunger or fear. Behind them came porters bearing ledgers, scrolls, and trays of scented oils. A proclamation was nailed to the old sycamore tree. New levies were to be imposed. Every household must provide a male youth for imperial service or pay a sum equivalent to 5 years' grain yield. Cries rose from the crowd, but quickly died as soldiers leveled their spears. That night, Elif wept softly into her shawl, for Zainab was their only child, and though she was a girl, the new edict did not exclude her. It was rumored that even young women were being sent to serve in distant palaces, not as soldiers, but as servants, concubines, or worse. Selim said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the grain of the old wood floor, where once his son had played with scraps of leather, pretending to shape boots of his own. That son had marched off with the Sultan's army 5 winters ago. They had not heard from him since. Later, when the lamps were extinguished and the village swallowed in darkness, Selim stepped outside. The air was thick and still, and the stars glinted like distant eyes. He walked through the alleyways, past shuttered windows and sleeping dogs, until he reached the edge of town where the walls crumbled into open scrubland. There, he knelt in the dust, his hands trembling, not from pain, but from a silent rage that had fermented over years. He did not pray. He had stopped doing that the night the guards took his son, the night the Empire's promise turned into a curse. Instead, he whispered the names of those he had lost, his son, his craft, his trust, his freedom, and let the silence take them, one by one. In Karsak, the dawn came slowly. It crept over broken walls and empty stalls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther each day. But Selim would rise again, as he always did, not because he hoped for change, but because he had no other choice. Like the basalt stones of the fortress, he would endure, even as the Empire forgot what it once stood to protect. Far to the west, where the Bosphorus met the Sea of Marmara in a gentle clash of currents and tides, the city of Constantinople stood draped in grandeur and decay alike. Its domes still shimmered in the morning sun, and its minarets pierced the sky like fingers in eternal prayer, but beneath the gilded surface, a slow unraveling crept through the streets like ivy. In the district of Fener, close to the old Byzantine walls, lived Layla, a seamstress by trade and a widow by fate. Her apartment overlooked a narrow street filled with the cries of vendors and the low, rhythmic chants of passing fishermen. Each morning, she leaned from her balcony to shake the dust from her linens and observe the world below, her eyes tracing every motion with a quiet, practiced attentiveness. Layla had been married at 17, a lifetime ago it seemed, to a man who worked in the naval docks. He was strong and kind, and he had loved her fiercely, but he was taken by the conscription rolls before their 3rd winter together. They told her he had died at sea, his ship sunk in a skirmish off the coast of the Levant. No body was returned, no words of comfort from the officials, just a scribbled note and an unpaid wage. She never remarried. In the years since, she had built her life around thread and patience. Her fingers were deft and sure, able to mend torn silks as easily as they could embroider flowers into the hem of a cloak. Her clients came from all walks, old pashas' wives seeking repairs, young girls preparing for betrothal, the occasional janissary needing his uniform stitched before an inspection. Her work was quiet, precise, and invisible, much like her place in the city's soul. Yet she saw everything. She saw the way the palace guards moved more frequently now through the streets, their eyes ever watchful, their faces unreadable. She saw the hesitation in the vendors' haggling, the glances over shoulders before any honest opinion was uttered. She saw the faces of the poor grow gaunter, their clothing more patched than sewn. The Empire, from her modest window, looked like a gown stretched too thin, still regal in silhouette, but fraying at every seam. She did not speak of these thoughts. Not to the neighbors who passed with cautious smiles, nor to the children who delivered cloth to her stoop, nor even to herself. Instead, she stitched. Each pattern, each careful seam was a meditation, a way to bring order to a world she no longer trusted. Then one evening, As the sky bled amber and pigeons whirled above the rooftops, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find a young girl, perhaps 12, clutching a bundle of worn velvet and looking about her with wide, frightened eyes. The girl said she had come on behalf of her mistress, a noblewoman recently widowed. There had been a tear in a ceremonial robe, something very old and dear, and the lady could not be seen in public until it was mended. The child's voice trembled with each word. Layla nodded gently and took the bundle inside. She knew the fabric immediately. It bore the faint perfume of roses and the woven signature of a palace tailor. This was not just any robe. It was court garb, marked for ceremonies held in the great halls of Topkapi itself. She worked through the night, lit only by a single oil lamp. The tear was small, but it lay across a crest, a delicate symbol of dynastic lineage. It was no accident that it had ripped. Something, Layla sensed, had changed in the air of the palace, though the walls around it still gleamed with wealth. When the girl returned the next morning, Layla hesitated. Then, as she handed over the garment, she whispered, "Tell your mistress the thread used is old. It won't hold another tear." The girl blinked, confused, then nodded and vanished down the steps. That evening, Layla locked her shutters for the first time in years. A few nights later, from her window, she watched a group of men in red sashes drag someone from a house nearby. There were no shouts, no accusations, just the quiet scraping of boots and the thud of a door left swinging open. No one emerged to ask questions. No one even peered out. The street fell into a silence more chilling than any scream. Layla returned to her sewing, but her hands no longer moved with their usual grace. She pricked her finger twice and bled onto the hem of a bridal veil. She did not bother to wash the stain. The city had grown sick, she realized, not with plague, but with fear. It was a sickness of the spirit, a slow suffocation under the weight of whispers and decrees, of names erased and rumors repeated behind closed lips. Even beauty, once abundant and effortless in Constantinople, now bore a cost too high for comfort. Still, each morning she rose and worked, because what else was there? She could not fight an empire. But she could sew one more seam, finish one more garment, and protect in her own quiet way the dignity of those who still dared to live in its shadow. She became known for her silence and her precision. She spoke little, asked no questions, and returned each order on time. And because of this, she remained invisible, safe in her corner of the fraying imperial tapestry, stitching beauty into a world that had forgotten what it looked like. And above her, the dome still gleamed, the call to prayer still echoed, and the pigeons still circled, blind to the sorrow that pooled like ink in the cracks of the city's marble bones. In the rugged northern reaches of the empire, where forests grew thick and stubborn along the spine of the Pontic Mountains, the village of Yarhisar clung to the slopes like moss to stone. The seasons there came with violence, winters that bit to the bone, summers thick with gnats and thunder, but the people were used to it. They had always lived in resistance to comfort. Among them was Halimi, an herbalist and widow of a village hunter who had died chasing a stag into a ravine. Her hair, once dark as raven's wings, had gone silver early, and she wore it in a long braid wrapped around her head like a crown of snow. The people of Yarhisar respected her, not because she was kind, though she was, but because she endured. In a land where children were lost to cold and crops to hail, endurance was holiness. Halimi lived at the edge of the village, near the stream that flowed down from the hills and sang against the rocks. Her home was modest, its walls built of pine and chinked with clay, but it held the sweet scent of drying herbs and simmering salves. Villagers came to her not only for medicine, but for counsel. She was not a midwife, nor a wise woman in the old sense, but something in her gaze made people speak honestly. In recent years, she had noticed the changing patterns. Not of nature, those she knew well, but of people. The empire's reach had grown more desperate, and its hand more cruel. Soldiers now patrolled even these remote forests, demanding oaths and firewood, grain and goats. Taxes were collected not in coin alone, but in promises. "Swear your loyalty," the captain would say. "Swear it again, louder, before your neighbors." As though the echo of fear might build a fortress. Halim said little during these visits. She gave them what she had to give, then watched them leave with her eyes narrowed and her hands steady. But it was not the soldiers who unsettled her most. It was the way the village had begun to unravel from within. Suspicion had taken root. Men who once helped each other raise barns now passed with tight mouths and averted eyes. Children were warned not to speak openly, even in play. Someone, no one knew who, had begun sending letters to the provincial seat. Letters that named names. Halime had her own suspicions. A young man named Sadik, new to the village, had appeared a year prior claiming to be a tinker. He fixed pots and sharpened blades, yet asked too many questions and answered too few. She watched him often from her window as he sat by the square, speaking to travelers, always listening more than he spoke. Then one night, a family vanished. The Karas, quiet folk with 2 daughters and a grandmother nearly blind, were simply gone by dawn. Their door was left open, the fire still smoldering in the hearth. No one spoke of it, but Halim noticed how the villagers began to lock their doors even during the day. She brewed valerian tea more often now, for herself and for others. The fear crept into dreams as well as days. People began to suffer from stomach knots, sleeplessness, headaches that never left. The body, she knew, remembered what the heart refused to confess. One afternoon, a girl named Aisha came to her in tears. Her brother had been taken by the patrols 2 days before for insubordination. He had refused to bow when an officer passed. Aisha was only 14, but her face had aged overnight. Halime held the girl's trembling hands and said softly, "He will survive if he does not speak. That is all we have left now. Silence." The girl nodded, though her lip bled where she'd bitten it. That night, Halime sat by her hearth and began to write. Not reports, not accusations, but stories. She wrote in the old tongue, blending folk tales with truth, disguising memory as myth. She wrote of shadowed wolves who prowled in uniforms, of owls that carried secrets through the forest, of herbs that bloomed only for those who remembered who they were. She hid these pages beneath the floorboards, unsure if she would ever show them to anyone. But writing became her defiance, a way to remember when the empire wished only for forgetting. One morning, as she gathered herbs in the meadow, she found Sadik watching her. He approached with a smile that did not reach his eyes and asked about a plant she held. She gave him a name in Latin, then a different one in Turkish, then turned and walked away. That evening, she boiled the plant and left a cup on her windowsill, untouched. A symbol, a warning. The next day, Sadik was gone. Whether he had been recalled or simply moved on, no one knew. But after that, Halime noticed a new stillness in the village. Not safety, but a pause, as if the forest itself was listening again. Life went on. Bread was baked, children scolded, fences mended. But beneath the routines ran a quiet current of resistance. And at its heart was Halime, silver-braided and sharp-eyed, guarding the memory of a freer world and waiting with the patience of stone for the empire to crumble under the weight of its own fear. The stream by her house kept singing, undeterred, and sometimes, when the night was soft and the sky clear, she would sit on her porch with a steaming bowl of mint tea and let its voice mingle with her own quiet thoughts. The empire might forget the names of places like Yarhisar, but Halime would remember, and that, she believed, was power enough. The plains of Rumeli, stretching wide and windswept beneath an endless sky, held within them villages so ancient their names seemed born of the land itself, soft consonants spoken in tones like wind through wheat. Among these was Kestelköy, a hamlet nestled between undulating hills and thin rivers, where stones marked boundaries and traditions held the soil together more surely than mortar ever could. In Kestelköy, there lived an old man named Cemil, once a scribe in the service of a provincial governor, now little more than a shadow among the barley fields. His eyes were clouded with age, but his memory remained clear, too clear at times. He remembered every decree he had penned, every name he had recorded, every order that came down from the capital like a falling star, bright, distant, and often deadly. Cemil had not left the village in 15 years. His home was small and slanted, half buried in vines, and filled with scrolls, ledgers, and scraps of poetry he had copied in younger days. No one asked him to write anymore. Ink was scarce, paper scarcer, and no one had the patience to read. But he still wrote, on birch bark, on the backs of discarded tax forms, on cloth scraps he stitched together into makeshift volumes. He wrote not for others, but to remember, because forgetting felt like betrayal. The village viewed him with wary respect. Children dared each other to touch his gate, and their mothers warned them not to linger near the scribe who knows too much. Even the elders, stooped and sun-weathered, nodded politely when they passed him, but did not stay long. They remembered, perhaps, that Shamil had once signed the documents that sent men away, sometimes to war, sometimes to prison, sometimes simply to vanish. He had not done so from cruelty. He was, at the time, a young man under orders. But in the Empire, obedience could be as poisonous as defiance. And the ink he had spilled had soaked deeper than parchment. One spring morning, as bees hummed among the almond blossoms and the village readied itself for a modest planting festival, a stranger arrived, a man in simple garb, with clean boots and the bearing of someone used to command. He introduced himself as Yusuf bin Harun, a census taker from Edirne. His voice was soft, but his questions were sharp. He asked of births and deaths, of who had left and who had arrived. He measured the fields, counted the livestock, and examined the tax records with furrowed brow. The villagers offered what answers they could, but watched him with guarded eyes. No one trusted a man who carried a leather satchel and asked questions with a smile. Yusuf came to Shamil last. The old man offered him tea, which the census taker accepted. They sat beneath the fig tree, its branches thick with promise, and exchanged pleasantries before Yusuf pulled a blank scroll from his satchel. "I've heard you were once in service," he said lightly. "Surely you understand the value of accurate records." Shamil smiled faintly and replied, "I understand that records can be used as weapons." Yusuf laughed, but there was a pause in it, as though the sound had to wait for permission to leave his lips. He dipped his quill and began to write. "How many households?" he asked. Shamil gave the number without hesitation. "But you'll find fewer souls than roofs. And why is that? Because war and hunger are better tax collectors than you'll ever be." The quill hovered. Yusuf looked up, his eyes cool. "You sound bitter, old man." "I'm not bitter," Shamil said softly. "I'm full of names, thousands of them, and I know where each name led." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the rustle of wind in the fig leaves. Later that evening, after Yusuf had gone to question others, Shamil opened a box beneath his bed. Within it were the sealed scrolls he had never delivered, letters from widows begging for reprieve, names of boys sent off without consent, lists of those who had died in tax riots in distant provinces. He had kept them all, unable to destroy them, unwilling to send them. They were the weight he carried. He took one scroll and walked to the edge of the village, where the earth sloped toward the river. There, beneath the dying light, he read the name aloud. Mehmet of Tekirdağ, pressed into service, aged 15. He burned the scroll and watched the ash drift down into the grass. It was not justice, it was not forgiveness, but it was memory. That night, Yusuf left the village without ceremony. He did not say goodbye. He took his scrolls and his figures and returned to the empire's vast belly to feed its records. But Shamil remained. Each day he wrote one more line, one more truth, and stored it among the others. Not because he believed the empire would ever read them, but because when the empire finally fell, as all empires must, someone, someday, might dig through the dust and find a name that had meant something. And in that moment, perhaps, the forgotten would rise again, not in vengeance, but in remembrance. And that, Shamil believed, would be enough. In the shifting sands of the empire's southern frontier, where the land turned to dust and the sun burned with a fierce and unrelenting eye, there stood the oasis town of Harbiya. It was a place of contrasts. Date palms rising like verdant prayers from scorched earth, and camels plodding along waterless roads with the slow dignity of prophets. The winds here carried the scent of cardamom and despair. Among the narrow lanes of Harbiya's stone-walled dwellings lived a boy named Rami, not yet 16, with limbs long and thin like the reeds that fringe the spring. He worked in the caravanserai, cleaning the floors and fetching fodder for beasts of burden, his life measured in cups of water and the weight of foreign travelers' glances. His mother had died, giving birth to his younger sister, and his father had vanished. Whether taken by raiders, the draft, or the desert itself, no one could say. Rami had learned early that to survive in Harbiya, one must speak little and listen well. He had never left the town. His world was bounded by sand dunes to the east, a crumbling mosque to the north, the olive orchard that never bore fruit to the south, and the endless caravans that came from the west. Traders from Aleppo, pilgrims from Medina, spice merchants from the Horn of Africa, all passed through, all stayed briefly, and all moved on. Only Rami remained. The empire's presence here was like the wind, unseen but felt, indifferent but inescapable. Taxes were gathered by men who arrived without warning and left without explanation, their ledgers pristine, their manners coarse. The garrison, small and idle, perched on a low hill like a snake too fat to strike. Its commander rarely left the shade of his awning. The town's imam, a quiet man with sun-browned skin and eyes like cooled ash, sometimes spoke of justice during Friday prayer. But justice, Rami thought, was a word for cooler lands, places where courts existed, where officials remembered faces and not just numbers. One morning, as the call to prayer echoed through the town like a sigh, a rumor bloomed across Harbia like a desert flower after rain. A royal envoy was coming, a real one from the capital, bearing a firman, an imperial decree. The town prepared itself. Lanterns were polished, the central square was swept clean, and even the camels were brushed until their coats shone like burnished leather. Rami was chosen to help carry water to the courtyard where the envoy would be received. He was proud for a moment, until he saw the man. The envoy arrived not with gold-threaded robes or ceremonial fanfare, but in silence, escorted by a dozen grim-faced guards. He was pale, as if the sun had never dared touch him, and he wore a ring with the Sultan's seal. He spoke little and smiled not at all. When the scroll was unrolled, its words carved in elaborate Ottoman Turkish, the crowd strained to understand. A scholar translated aloud, Harbia would be reassigned, its autonomy revoked, its elders replaced by appointed officials from the imperial interior. The oasis, and all its resources, was henceforth considered crown land, and all inhabitants were to register anew as subjects not of the local bey, but of the central diwan. The words were cold, final, unarguable. Rami watched as the townspeople bowed their heads in resignation. A few murmured prayers. One man spat and was quietly dragged away by the soldiers. No one spoke up. No one dared. That evening, the lights of Harbia burned low. The envoy and his guards dined in private, their feast transported in brass trays from the caravanserai's kitchens. Rami helped serve, and as he moved through the courtyard with a jug of water, he overheard the envoy laughing softly with a scribe. It's all sand and goats, the man said, but it will pay well once the tax farms are in place. That night, Rami sat beside the spring, his knees drawn to his chest, staring at the stars mirrored in the still water. He thought of his mother's stories, of warriors who once rode beneath crescent moons, not for empire, but for justice, of caliphs who walked the streets in disguise to hear the truth of their people, of honor that was more than a word. The next morning, a list was nailed to the mosque door, names of those assigned new duties, new taxes, new boundaries. Rami's was among them. He was now to serve in the garrison's stable, under direct imperial command. He said nothing. He reported as ordered. But he began to listen more carefully. He mapped the routines of the guards. He memorized the places where shadows fell longest. He noted who came and who left and when. In time, he would leave Harbia. Not to serve, but to seek. For now, he waited. Not all who lived beneath empire were loyal. Not all who smiled were blind. Even the smallest seed buried in sand remembers the rain. And Rami, son of a forgotten father, grandson of a vanished people, would remember everything. Because the desert forgets nothing, and neither would he. High in the western mountains of the empire, where the sky stretched blue and boundless over jagged peaks, there clung a monastery carved into the very bones of the stone. Suraya, it was called, though its name had fallen from most tongues and was remembered only by the wind and the birds who nested in its eaves. Once, it had been a sanctuary of learning and prayer, a place where silence was sacred and words were tended like gardens. Now it stood quiet and near forgotten, its frescoes fading and its great brass bell green with moss. Only one soul remained within its walls. Brother Jakob, the last of the monastic scribes, lived there in a rhythm as old as the mountain paths. He was a man aged like parchment, with a spine slightly bowed and hands ink-stained from decades of work. His robes were worn and his sandals patched, yet he moved with a dignity untouched by time or empire. He had taken his vows in youth, back when Suraya still echoed with debate and song, when scholars came from across the empire to study in its high, vaulted library. He had been young then, hungry for truth, eager to serve something higher than courts and coin. That time had passed. Years ago, edicts from the capital had condemned all independent centers of learning. Schools were brought under imperial authority, libraries cataloged and censored, monasteries closed or converted. One by one, Jakob's brothers had left or had been taken. Some were forced into service as clerks for provincial governors. Others disappeared altogether, their names erased from records as if they had never lived. But Jakob had remained. He stayed not out of stubbornness or cowardice, but out of devotion. To silence, to memory, to the slow and sacred act of writing. He believed in the power of recorded truth, in the preservation of voices long silenced. Each day, he awoke before the sun crested the ridge and lit a small brazier to boil tea. Then, by lamplight he worked, copying manuscripts that no one had asked for, preserving poems in tongues no one else spoke. He wrote on birch bark and stitched scraps of linen into pages when paper ran scarce. There were no readers left, but still he wrote. Then one morning, as mist curled through the stone corridors and dew clung to the monastery's empty cloisters, a knock came at the old gate. Jakob paused in his task, quill suspended mid-stroke. The gate had not sounded in years. He moved slowly, the wooden floor groaning beneath his weight, and opened the door to find a girl no older than 17. She was thin and hollow-eyed, her travel cloak torn, her sandals caked with red mountain clay. Her hands clutched a satchel, and her voice trembled when she spoke. "My name is Miriam," she said. "They said someone here remembers." Jakob studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and motioned her in. She came each day after that. He poured her tea and asked no questions, though the grief in her eyes told him enough. Slowly, as the silence between them became familiar, she began to speak. Her brother had been taken by imperial guards in Erzurum for quoting a banned poem during a gathering of apprentices. No charges, no trial, no word since. Her family had been watched since then, her home searched, her books burned. She had fled north, away from cities and roads, following only the thinnest rumors of a monastery where the past still lived, where old texts were kept, where a man still remembered what the empire wished to forget. Jakob did not promise justice. He did not offer comfort. But he gave her stories. He told her of caliphs who had walked their cities in disguise to hear their subjects' needs, of courts in Cordoba where Muslim, Christian, and Jew debated under candlelight, of women who had written philosophy and led armies. He showed her pages written by hands long turned to dust, verses once whispered in love or fury or defiance. These were not rebels, he told her one afternoon as they sat by the window. They were people who asked questions. The empire fears questions. Why? She asked, her brow furrowed. Because a question is a crack, he replied, and an empire built on fear cannot survive the light that seeps through cracks. She stayed through the spring and well into summer, learning not only from his words, but from the way he moved through the world, slow, attentive, reverent. He taught her how to bind pages, how to read in 3 scripts, how to recognize when truth had been rewritten. One morning, she did not come, nor the next. Jakob waited, his heart hollow with knowing. He searched the paths, but found no sign of her. She had gone, as suddenly as she had arrived, disappearing back into the empire's great and hungry silence. He did not despair. He returned to his writing with new purpose. He began a new volume, smaller than most, meant not for storage but for travel. A compendium of truths, stories, names, fragments of memory stitched with care. He wrote it in a small, neat hand, and when he finished, he wrapped it in oiled cloth and placed it beneath a loose stone in the eastern wall. Perhaps she would return. Perhaps someone else would find it. He continued to write day after day until his breath grew short and his sight blurred. When winter came, early and sharp, it found him seated at his desk, head bowed, pen resting in a half-finished line. The empire never marked his passing. No bell tolled, no decree noted his name. But deep in the mountains, beneath the snow and stone, the last scribe of Suraya had written a map of memory. And someday, someone would read it. Not to restore the past, but to remember that it had once existed. And that, in a world where forgetting was a weapon, remembrance was an act of quiet rebellion. Part 19. the dawn rose over the Anatolian highlands, casting a soft apricot hue across the worn rooftops of the town of Tokat. Here, in this quiet and oft-forgotten corner of the empire, the old rhythms of life moved more slowly than the frantic pulse of the capital. But the weight of imperial neglect was more deeply felt in places like this, far from the gilded palaces of Istanbul and the perfumed shadows of its courtly intrigues. In the rustic alleys and time-smooth cobblestones, one could hear the groaning of the common people, heavy with the burdens placed upon them, not only by nature, but by empire itself. In this particular season, drought had come early and lingered late. The fields, once golden with wheat and barley, now stood parched and cracking, like the heels of the old shepherds who cursed the sky and muttered prayers to saints and jinn alike. Farmers, whose families had tilled the same soil for generations, now found their livestock thin and their granaries hollow. And yet the taxman came, as punctual and unyielding as the sunrise, demanding dues for harvests that had never ripened. It was the system of tithes and imperial levies that broke the backs of so many. A labyrinthine bureaucracy had evolved, wrapping its tendrils into every village and hillside, demanding coin, crop, or flesh. Men were pressed into corvée labor, dragged from their homes to build roads they would never travel, or to quarry stone for fortresses that belonged to sultans who would never speak their names. The empire's appetite was endless, and even in times of plenty, it was never sated. In times of want, it became ravenous. One such man was Mehmet of the lower quarter. He had been a strong man once, broad-shouldered and quick-witted, with arms built from years of turning soil and swinging scythe. But now he walked with a stoop, his back curved by both labor and sorrow. His only son, Emre, had been taken the year before by a passing detachment of Sipahis, conscripted into some far-off campaign in the east. No letter had come, no word returned, only silence, and the whispered grief of a mother who refused to speak his name aloud for fear of confirming the worst. Mehmet still worked his small patch of land, though his tools were rusted and his oxen long since sold. He bartered for seed with whatever he could spare, a goat's milk, a woven cloth, sometimes even a pair of hens. But the soil yielded less with each passing year, and the debts grew heavier. When the imperial assessor came through, mounted high and flanked by janissary escorts, Mehmet offered all he had. It was not enough. They took his last sack of barley, and with it, his dignity. He watched them ride away, their cloaks stirring up dust in the road, while his wife wept behind the doorway. Yet, as cruel as the taxmen were, worse still was the corruption beneath them. Local agas, given charge over their regions, often exploited the weakness of imperial oversight. They inflated the quotas, demanded bribes, and stored away grain in their own cellars while the poor starved through winter. Justice was a distant thing, dispensed by Qadi judges who owed their robes to the same agas they were meant to oversee. If a farmer lodged a complaint, he risked not only failure but retribution. Crops burned, cattle poisoned, daughters married off without consent. Thus, most kept silent, whispering their complaints to the wind and hoping the next year might be kinder. In the evenings, when the shadows stretched long and the oil lamps flickered like spirits in the windows, the people gathered in courtyards to share bread, song, and stories. There was solace, fleeting but precious, in the comfort of community. Old tales were told, not of the Sultan's glory or battles won in foreign lands, but of long-ago harvests when the rains came early, of weddings that lit up the town for 3 nights, and of ancestors who once defied drought with nothing but their will. One elder, a hunched woman named Hava, held the children close and told them of the hidden prince, a figure of local legend who walked among the poor in disguise, gathering their sufferings into his cloak. Someday, she said, he would return in full regalia, bearing justice like a sword. The children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations kindled, though the adults merely smiled with tired eyes. They had learned long ago not to expect saviors. The women bore the brunt of much that went unsaid. With the men often absent through war, labor, or imprisonment, the management of the home fell to them. They fetched water from distant wells, tended to the sick, and spun cloth through the long hours of night. If a husband returned maimed or ill, it was the wife who nursed him. If he did not return at all, it was she who negotiated with creditors and fended off suitors more interested in land than love. And yet, they found ways to endure, through lullabies, through the scent of mint tea, and through a quiet strength that history seldom records. Still, suffering was not constant. It pulsed like a fever, rising and falling. There were festivals, too, when music filled the air and dancers spun like leaves caught in a breeze. On such nights, the empire seemed distant, the palace a fiction, and joy a fleeting miracle. People laughed then, not because they had no pain, but because they knew how precious it was to feel anything else. As the season turned, the town of Tokat braced for another round of assessments. The rumors swirled that a new governor had been appointed, young and ambitious. Some hoped he might be kinder, others feared he would be worse. The truth, as always, would reveal itself in time. But for now, Mehmet sat beneath the olive tree at the edge of his field, its roots deep and its branches old. He looked out at the land he had always known, dusty, cracked, but still his. Somewhere, he imagined, Emre was watching the same sunset, perhaps with the same ache in his chest. The breeze rustled the leaves gently, like a lullaby hummed by the earth itself, and for a brief moment, the empire's shadow grew a little lighter. Part 20. The summer of that year arrived heavy and slow, like a curtain that would not rise. In the countryside beyond Tokat, a strange stillness fell over the land. Even the birds, once jubilant with morning songs, seemed to have quieted, as though they too bore the hush of expectation. The wind moved only in brief sighs, and the olive groves stood in solemn silence, their branches drooping from months without rain. Farmers turned their faces skyward each day, lips cracked and brows furrowed, watching for clouds that never came. In the village of Alara, nestled along the ancient gorge and fed by a stream that now trickled like a forgotten lullaby, the people spoke less than before. They conserved their words as they did their water, carefully, reluctantly. Families began to ration bread more strictly. A single flat loaf might stretch across 2 days, soaked in oil and salt, and divided among children with fingers too thin for their age. But even as famine threatened, the empire demanded its due. A new decree had come from the central provinces. In light of the Eastern Wars and the Sultan's ambitious campaigns near the Safavid border, rural populations were to double their tribute. The scribe who read the edict aloud in the town square trembled beneath his turban, and the crowd responded not with shouts or resistance, but with a silence so deep that the wind itself dared not speak. Among those who listened was a man named Salim, a former soldier turned stonemason. He had returned from the frontier a decade ago, his right leg wounded by shrapnel from a fire pot hurled across a fortress wall. He had left behind comrades buried beneath desert sands and a commanding officer who had once promised glory. What Salim received instead was a limp and a forgotten name. Now, he worked shaping stones for village wells and mending collapsed vineyard walls, his hands steady but his heart often elsewhere. His wife, Layla, kept their home with a quiet grace. She was a weaver, her loom set against the back wall where sunlight filtered in through lattice wood. The clatter of threads once brought comfort, but of late it had become a rhythm of anxiety, marking the hours until they knew whether they would keep their land or lose it to the governor's new collectors. One evening, Salim returned from his work with a face carved by concern. A traveler had passed through, a gaunt man with cracked boots and a voice like dried reeds, who spoke of entire villages to the east being cleared, families uprooted for failing to meet tax quotas, their homes burned as examples. Layla listened, her hands never stopping their weaving, though her eyes had gone glassy. When Salim finished speaking, she simply nodded and asked if the man had said where the soldiers went next. Fear crept not like a beast, but like a mist, slow and unseen, curling around doorways and settling into corners. The village elders gathered beneath the cypress trees to discuss what little they could do. Some suggested hiding valuables in the hills. Others whispered of escape, though none could say where to. The empire's reach, after all, was vast. From the Balkans to the mountains of Armenia, there was scarcely a land where one could flee and not still be under the shadow of the crescent. Meanwhile, the children of Ilara continued to play, oblivious to the weight carried by their parents. They ran between trees, fashioned flutes from reeds, and built castles of dust. Their laughter was a strange balm, a reminder of the sweetness of moments untouched by fear. Yet even they began to notice the thinning meals, the hollow looks, the strange hush that had overtaken the songs at evening. The mosque's imam, an old man named Yusuf with a beard like snow and a voice soft as falling cloth, began to offer longer prayers. His sermons turned from theological musings to gentle appeals for strength, patience, and mercy. He spoke not of judgment, but of endurance, quoting verses that called for stillness in the face of storm. People came to him not only for spiritual guidance, but also to share their worries, their quiet despairs, their hopes too fragile to speak aloud elsewhere. And in the stillness, small acts of resistance took root, not in fire or blade, but in solidarity. Neighbors began to share bread quietly at night, placing it at each other's doorsteps. Layla traded her woven cloths for flour with a widow 2 streets over, though no coin changed hands. Salim worked without pay for a blind man whose wall had collapsed in the rains months earlier. No one said the word rebellion, but all knew that to care for each other was, in its own way, defiance. Then one day, the collectors arrived. Their horses were sleek and well-fed, their armor polished to a blinding sheen. The lead official dismounted with ceremony, a man in rich robes who wore the seal of the governor like a badge of conquest. Behind him came scribes and armed escorts. They read the decree again, louder this time, though none needed reminding. The villagers stood still, their faces unreadable. Salim stepped forward, his limp pronounced. He spoke calmly, asking for an extension, for mercy. He explained the drought, the famine, the impossibility of fulfilling the tribute. The official did not meet his eyes. He simply motioned to his men. They entered homes, took what they found, grain, tools, even copper bowls. They marked doors with charcoal, indicating which families would be revisited. One child tried to hide a handful of raisins in his tunic. A soldier struck him, and his mother screamed, a sound that would echo in memory far longer than the soldier's bootsteps. When they left behind not only empty pantries, but something deeper, a severance of trust. The people of Ilara no longer felt forgotten. They felt betrayed. That night, the village did not light its oil lamps. The darkness was near total, broken only by the stars above and the occasional flicker from hearths hidden behind thick curtains. Salim sat beside Layla, who had ceased her weaving. In his hand, he held a small stone he had carved long ago, shaped like a bird in flight. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. "They always do," he replied, voice low. And in the hush that followed, the stone rested between them, a silent promise that something of beauty could still be made, even from the hardest things. Part 21. The days after the collector's departure hung like a curtain of gray cloth over Ilara. The villagers moved more slowly, speaking in hushed tones, casting glances over shoulders, as if expecting shadows to rise from the earth itself. The pain had become familiar, but this fresh humiliation reopened wounds that had barely begun to scar. Salim returned to his stones with a quieter demeanor. The tap of his chisel had once echoed like music through the narrow paths of the village, a rhythmic assurance that life continued. Now it sounded less often, as if the stone, too, had grown weary. Layla ceased weaving entirely, her loom gathering dust in the sunlit corner. Her hands, once quick and graceful, now lay idle in her lap, clutching a scrap of cloth that had once been meant for trade. The color in the threads had faded. So, too, had much else. And yet, even in the quiet ruin of their daily life, something else stirred, deep and slow, like water rising beneath the soil after a long drought. It was not hope, not quite, more like the murmuring of an instinct too ancient to name, a pull toward gathering, toward listening, toward deciding. For all the empire had taken, it had not broken their will to remember one another. The elders convened again beneath the cypress trees. They were fewer now, and their backs were more bent than before. But their voices carried a firmness that had not been heard in many moons. No great rebellion was planned, no torches lit, no swords drawn from beneath floorboards. Such things belonged to ballads and madmen. What they discussed was far more dangerous to tyranny, cohesion, understanding, the power of a people united not by violence, but by shared suffering and quiet dignity. The decision was made to send a small delegation westward toward Kayseri, where word had spread of a former court scholar turned wandering teacher, a man known only as Hadir. Rumors painted him as a mystic, a physician of words, someone who understood the language of the poor and could recite the imperial edicts with perfect recall. Some said he had once advised a pasha and had fled the court in disgust. Others whispered he had been a janissary who laid down his sword in Mecca. Whatever his past, the people believed he might know what they could not, that there were laws even the empire itself had forgotten, protections buried under decades of dust and abuse. If they could bring him to Ilara, perhaps there would be a way to appeal, not to power, but to the idea of justice the empire had once claimed to uphold. So it was that Selim and a younger man, Aslan, a shepherd's son with sharp eyes and a steady stride, set off under cover of early morning. They carried no banner, no coin, only dried bread, 2 flasks of water, and a letter written in careful script by Imam Yusuf, sealed with the village's oldest signet ring, a remnant from when Ihlara had once been a place of modest renown. The road to Kayseri was long and unwelcome. Bandits lurked in rocky outcroppings, and imperial patrols questioned travelers with increasing suspicion. But Selim and Aslan traveled as father and son, their roles rehearsed, their story rehearsed further still. In every town they passed, they slept beneath stables or in the corners of derelict inns, always listening, always asking after Hadir. Days passed in slow measure. The air grew cooler as they ascended higher terrain, and their bodies stiffened from the journey. Selim's limp worsened, and Aslan offered to carry more than his share, his youth lending strength where Selim's memories lent caution. They spoke little, but understood each other more deeply with each mile. In the foothills beyond Kayseri, near a ruined caravanserai where fig trees broke through crumbling stone, they found him. Hadir was older than they had expected, his beard streaked with white, his robes patched but clean. He sat beneath a tree surrounded by a small circle of listeners, children, traders, even a few veiled women, speaking softly about the meanings of justice in a world where power so often forgot it. When Selim approached and offered the letter, Hadir took it without question. He read it slowly, once, then again. His eyes did not widen, nor did his brows rise. Instead, he sighed as if he had read the same plea 100 times before. "You are not the first," he said quietly, "but perhaps your village will be among the last to wait in silence." That night, the 3 of them sat beside a modest fire, and Hadir listened to every word Selim and Aslan had to offer. He asked precise questions about names, dates, the wording of edicts, the behavior of the governor's men. Selim, with his soldier's memory, recalled nearly all. Aslan spoke of the children, of the bruised boy, of the mother's scream that lingered still. When morning came, Hadir did not ask permission. He simply stood and gathered his things. "I will come with you," he said. "Not because it will change all things, but because silence is the only crime that feeds itself." And so the road back to Ilara began, not with weapons or banners, but with a man who carried only his voice, 2 villagers whose hearts bore more weight than their backs, and the fragile promise that knowledge, when spoken with courage, might yet be heard. Part 22. The journey back to Ihlara was not swift. The road was longer than Selim remembered, or perhaps it was simply that the burden they now carried, hope, thin as a reed but sharp as a blade, made every step feel like the beginning of something that could not be undone. Hadir walked with the slow certainty of one who knew the weight of time. He did not speak often, but when he did, his words were chosen with the same care a physician uses to select herbs for a fevered patient. He told no tales of revenge or upheaval. Instead, he spoke of ancient laws, of the promises made by sultans long dead, etched in Old Persian and Arabic on cracked parchment and lost to the dust of forgotten archives. He spoke of waqf lands meant to protect the poor, of edicts that forbade overtaxation in times of drought, and of a time when scholars walked alongside rulers, not behind them in silence. Aslan listened with burning eyes. He had never imagined that paper could be as sharp as steel, or that knowledge could deflect tyranny as a shield might deflect an arrow. Selim, more weathered in both body and soul, said less. But the silence he offered Hadir was not emptiness. It was space. Space for something rare to take root. When the trio arrived at the outer reaches of Ilara, word of their return had already preceded them. Children raced ahead, calling names and spreading whispers like wind across wheat. By the time they reached the village square, a quiet gathering had already formed. Men with calloused hands, women with tired eyes, elders whose skin had folded like worn linen, and young ones who had never known a season without fear. Hadir did not stand on any raised platform. He did not shout. He simply removed a small scroll from his satchel and began to read. Not with drama, but with a clarity that cut through the murmurs like morning light through mist. The villagers heard, many for the first time, the words of the imperial code. Let it be known that in years of famine, no village shall be burdened beyond its yield. Let it be known that tribute without just assessment is theft in the eyes of the Sultan. Let it be known that the cry of the poor, when true, carries to the court of heaven. There was no applause, no sudden cheer, but something shifted. The square, for all its dust and sorrow, became sacred. Not because of Hadir's scroll, but because the people now knew what they had only guessed at before. That the weight they bore was not ordained, but imposed, and could, in time, be removed. In the days that followed, Hadir stayed with Imam Yusuf. Together, they pored over every record the village had preserved. Old tax ledgers, family rolls, grain tallies, even a rusted seal from a forgotten inspector. They drafted a formal complaint, written in elegant Ottoman script, bound with red ribbon and marked by the fingerprints of every family in Ilara. Salim and Aslan did not accompany Hadir on the next leg of the journey. This time, it was Hadir who walked alone toward the governor's palace in the regional capital. He traveled not as a petitioner, but as a scholar bearing lawful grievance. The outcome was not swift. Weeks passed, then months. But in the interim, something changed in Ilara. The fear that had once crept in corners and echoed in silence now found itself exiled. Families once divided by hunger shared freely again. The well at the edge of town, long neglected, was repaired. Layla returned to her loom, her hands no longer weaving only to survive, but to create. Her cloths took on richer colors, inspired by dusk skies and ripe fruit. Salim began shaping stone for a new wall, not one for defense, but for memory. On it, he etched a single phrase from Hadir's scroll, one that the villagers took to repeating at dusk like a prayer. Let it be known. And one day, when the high clouds moved fast over the hills and the air smelled faintly of copper and clover, a rider appeared on the horizon. He bore no weapons, only a letter sealed in the blue wax of the governor's court. It was addressed to the people of Ilara. The complaint had been received. Investigations would follow. The taxes would be suspended for the year, and an envoy dispatched to review the village's condition. It was not a reversal of all things. The empire remained vast, the world still uncertain, but justice, real, breathing, imperfect justice, had reached them, not as a miracle, but as something earned. That evening, as dusk folded itself over the valley and the villagers gathered beneath the cypress trees, Imam Yusuf stood beside Hadir, who had returned just in time to witness what he had helped shape. No speeches were made. Instead, the villagers sang. Their voices rose gently, carrying into the night like the memory of wind over tall grass. It was not a song of triumph, nor was it loud, but it was full, and it was theirs. And far away, in some distant chamber of the empire where scribes recorded names they would never see, the village of Ilara appeared in careful ink, not as a place conquered, but as one that had endured.